Incredible show. This is going to be an action-packed show. A lot to talk about. We talked about all college football. We talked about NFL football last night. We're going to talk about today. We're going to shift our focus into college basketball, some NBA basketball, some more college football, because remember, the new college playoff rankings will be released tonight as well. But Matt, one thing I want to mention is let's go in and let's start off our show with some Major League Baseball, because Major League Baseball, we talk about that it's now the official offseason. The World Series ended a couple weeks back, and now we're going to see a lot of teams a lot of players on the move. We're going to see a lot of players on the move, including one big name, Shohei Ohtani. Shohei Ohtani, there have been rumors and reports that he is interested in joining the Atlanta Braves.
And yeah, it's definitely, he's really been, at least in the later stages of the regular season last year, he was kind of that big ticket highlight player that you were looking at as potentially could be making a move in the offseason and changing teams during the offseason, just because of all of the different rumors that were going on. I mean, there was one that he had pretty much cleared out his locker room in LA. In the home locker room for the Angels, he had cleared out his locker room of all of his personal items. So there was rumors about that going around. It's obvious that there's a chance Shohei Ohtani is going to be going somewhere else this upcoming season. And you talk about a team that, I'm not saying they don't need him, but you talk about a team that doesn't really need him. The Braves, if they get Shohei Ohtani, they were already a 100-win team last season. I would expect them to be a 110-plus win team this upcoming year if they do get Shohei.
And you know, Matt, that's one thing that we talked about a little bit ago on this show, and we talked about how players and how teams can afford higher-end players and multiple of them because they are a bigger market team. And Atlanta fits that mold, especially. And you look at who they have. They have Ronald Acuna. They have Ozzy Albies. Now they're looking at trying to punch and bring in Shohei Ohtani. They have Matt Olson as well. The Atlanta Braves are stacked from top to bottom. And remember, a couple weeks ago on this show, we talked about the market discrepancy between higher end and big markets like the Atlanta Braves, like Los Angeles, like New York, yada, 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 yada. And then some of the smaller market teams such as Kansas City, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. And that's really been a debate that's been going around in Major League Baseball for the last couple of years, has been, does there need to be a salary cap in Major League Baseball? We see it in NBA. We see it in NFL as well. Is it time for Major League Baseball to get a salary cap? You and I both voted in favor, yes, for it. We think it's time, but nonetheless, that's still just our opinion. In the thick of things, doesn't matter. Our opinion does not matter. So at Major League Baseball, obviously, they have yet to go to that salary cap, and there's been some debate going back and forth between Major League Baseball, some of the owners and associations. I believe it's been up for some of the owners to vote on it a couple of times in years prior. But Matt, really nothing has come into fruition. And now we could very well see some big free agents land on big market teams this season across Major League Baseball, including Shohei Ohtani. And he says he wants to go to a contender. Maybe Atlanta is the best fit for Shohei Ohtani.
Yeah, and when I was saying that they don't need him, it's not that the team wouldn't improve without him. It's just the team's already good enough as it is. If you add a player like Shohei Ohtani to that roster, it's only going to make them astronomically better. If I'm not mistaken, they had the most wins in the MLB last season. I believe it was by 3 or 4 wins total. But still, you take a look at how good that Braves team was a season ago. Obviously, it would help the team a ton getting a player like Shohei Ohtani. But you talk about a team that, it's not that, like I said, it's not that they don't need him, but you're going to go from a 100-plus win team to maybe a 110-plus win team if you get a player like Shohei Ohtani on the roster, as opposed to, obviously, it's not to say this would happen. Say if the Reds got Shohei Ohtani. Obviously, like you said, the Reds are a little bit of a smaller market team, probably not going to be able to afford a player like Shohei Ohtani, but when it comes down to having a player like Shohei Ohtani in Cincinnati, it's a big bat for the lineup. It's a great arm for the pitching staff. It would help. It would probably propel the Reds to maybe a 90-plus win season this upcoming year, but I still think wherever Shohei Ohtani goes, kudos to him for getting that money. For whatever team he ends up signing with this upcoming season, and whatever team does end up getting Shohei Ohtani, they are going to improve by quite a bit, no matter what team it is that gets him.
Not to mention the fact, Matt, you mentioned whichever team gets Shohei Ohtani, that team is going to improve quite a bit. And if you're already one of the best teams in Major League Baseball, it's hard to believe that you can even still improve and increase. But Matt, Shohei Ohtani, we talked about faces of baseball, and we talked about this during the World Series, especially on the run that Adolis Garcia was on for the Texas Rangers. But Shohei Ohtani is the face of Major League Baseball right now, and it's only going to grow Major League Baseball whichever team he goes to.
Yeah, whichever team he goes to, the market value for that team is going to go up. The jersey sales for that team is going to go up, especially if they immediately put out a Shohei Ohtani jersey for their team. Jersey sales are going to go up. The popularity of that team is going to go up because, like you said, Shohei Ohtani right now is the face of baseball. Batting-wise, he's got baseballs flying off the bat at 100-plus miles an hour, and then he throws pitches towards batters at 100 miles an hour. There's not many players that have been able to do that in the history of baseball, and there's not many players that in the future of baseball are going to be able to do that. So you talk about an impact player, you talk about the perfect type of player, especially to, like you brought up and I brought up, increase the market value of your team and increase merchandise sales for your team. Shohei Ohtani, like you said, he's the face of baseball for a reason. Whichever team he goes to, they're definitely going to see an increase in fans, and they're going to see an increase in sales as well.
And not to mention a lot more big free agent names on the table as well this season. Of course, Cody Bellinger, he's a free agent, former Chicago Cub, who really went to Chicago, leaving Los Angeles, went to Chicago, different change of scenery, and he kind of resurrected his career. It was a tremendous season for Cody Bellinger, and not only him, but there are plenty of other great free agent names on the market. Aaron Nola, one of the ace pitchers for the Philadelphia Phillies, who can pretty much go to any other team in Major League Baseball and be considered the ace pitcher of that pitching staff. But Matt, there's also some big names. Joey Votto, he is officially a free agent as Cincinnati declined his $20 million option, the club option to pick him up for another year. So he's officially a free agent as well. And also, not to mention, remember, here's an old pitcher's, I don't want to say old pitcher's name because when it comes down to age, he's not that old, but this is a pitcher who has pitched in the major leagues, has been very effective in the major leagues, but has not pitched in the major leagues for a couple of years. He had some legal battles. He was proven innocent. Everything that was in his name legally was pretty much wrapped up. He's free to go. He's good to play some baseball. Trevor Bauer, also a big name to watch out for on the free agent market as well this offseason.
Yeah, there's a lot of big names, especially you talk about Shohei Ohtani, you talk about Sonny Gray. I think he's also in the free agent market. He, at least with the Reds, had a pretty good season, and then even after that, when the Reds got rid of him and traded him away, he had some pretty phenomenal seasons and a pretty phenomenal slate of games. When the Reds decided to get rid of him, that was one move that I didn't personally like myself. I loved watching Sonny Gray pitch. But yeah, you've also got Cody Bellinger. You've got a ton of players that can have impact on whatever team they go to. Trevor Bauer is also going to have some impact on whatever team he goes to. There's just a lot of players on the market right now that going to teams, they are definitely going to have impact on whatever teams they go to. And that's why this free agent market this year is going to be so fun to watch, because you've got so many big names that can move. Not all of them are guaranteed to move to different teams, but you've got so many big names that can shuffle around and find different teams this upcoming season. It's going to cause, I wouldn't say chaos, but it's going to cause a little bit of chaos this offseason to see where everybody goes, how everything shakes out, and how good teams are going to improve when they decide to spend some money in the free agent or spend some money in free agency and try to pick up a big name player that's on the market right now.
And not to mention the trade market is going to be absolutely wild as well. And there's a lot of rumors circling the Cincinnati Reds as well. We're going to talk about the Reds here in our very next 15 minutes of the show. But Matt, a lot of big names. I expect the Reds, I've mentioned this the last couple of weeks, I expect Cincinnati and I expect the Reds to be active in free agency. I expect them to go out and sign some pitching. I expect them to go out and sign an outfield bat. I expect them to be active and very, very active. It wouldn't also surprise me. We've seen the Reds in years past. They like bringing players that slip away through their hands. They like bringing them back to Cincinnati. We saw that with Curt Casali. Curt Casali, he was on the Reds back in 2021, went elsewhere for the 2022 season. He came back in the 2023 season. The Reds like to bring players back. So, Matt, is it a theme that'll continue. There's a lot of former Reds that were really great as Reds, such as Sonny Gray, such as Trevor Bauer. Their names are going to be big in the offseason for free agency across Major League Baseball. Is it out of reach? Do we see that continued theme of maybe the Reds put in some offers on some players that formerly played on their team, trying to bring them back to the 5-1-3?
I don't think it's completely out of the realm of possibility that we see a player such as Sonny Gray make their way back to the Reds. The only reason I would say maybe not Trevor Bauer is because he hasn't been pitching in the MLB these past few seasons, but it's still not out of the realm of possibility that Bauer could end up coming back to the Cincinnati Reds. You just never know. There's so many different players like we've talked about. I mean, I think Aaron Nola might be a little bit too high of a price point for the Reds to try to go for, but you just take a look at all the pitchers that are in free agency right now. You take a look at all of the bats in free agency right now that are up for bidding. Teams are going to try to fight for them. So I don't see it out of the realm of possibility that we maybe see Sonny Gray come back to the Reds, maybe see Trevor Bauer come back to the Reds, because either of those two players right now, if they find their way back into the Reds organization, I think it's going to be not immediate impact, but it's definitely going to be a help to that pitching rotation, because the Reds, I've talked about it a few different times. You've talked about it a few different times, Jackson. If there's one thing that the Reds seem like they really need to try to fix, it's the pitching rotation. And if they can get that fixed and they can get that figured out, this Reds team is easily going to be a postseason team, maybe even winning a few series in the postseason this upcoming year.
We already mentioned what the Reds need in the offseasons, at least what we think what they need in the offseason. But there's also some circling rumors that, once again, we saw this in the regular season. Now it's continuing on. Matt, we gave our opinions on this back in the regular season, I believe it was in August or so. But Jonathan India, once again, his name circling around in trade rumors. So we're talking about that and more coming up in the next 15. But Matt, hey, guess what? It's that time of the year. Obviously, no Major League Baseball games being played, but at the same time, I would go out and argue that this may be the most important time of the year for Major League Baseball, because you're going to see so many great players on the move. And not to mention, this is where teams make their team better. I expect the Reds to be active because, remember, a couple years ago, the Texas Rangers, they were a 100-loss team. They were active in free agency. Just 2 years later, they built a World Series championship team. So nonetheless, they made their money. They were able to make things work for them in free agency, also with the young core that they have brought up as well. So who's going to be the next team that builds their team just like the Texas Rangers did to win a World Series?
Well, there's definitely going to be, you talk about this is probably one of the bigger moments for a lot of teams. It's definitely the biggest time of the year for teams that were just on the outside of making it into the postseason and just missed out by a few games. So the Cincinnati Reds are one of those teams that you think about with teams that just missed out on making it into the postseason. The Cubs are another team that are in this same boat. The Mariners are another team that are in this same boat. This is the time of year where you need to pick up players that are going to increase your chances of getting over that hump and making it into the postseason this upcoming year, especially for a team like the Cincinnati Reds that are such a young team. You're only going to have, 3 years in this window? 3 years left in this window, I should say, or around 2 to 4 years probably left in this window for the Reds. If you don't start now, it's going to be too late. So the Reds are a team that definitely need to try to make some moves during this offseason. And if not, I'm not saying that the Reds won't make it into the postseason next year, but there's a really good chance that this Reds team sticks around where they were this year, especially with the fact that they don't have a player like Joey Votto, who, if the Reds go on a massive losing streak during the season or they start getting down on themselves, there's not going to be that leadership figure and that leadership role player to pick the team back up, get them back on the right track, get them back in the right mindset, and help them turn around a potential slow spot of the season. So this Reds team, this is the time right now to try to improve your team, to try to get your team ready for a playoff push next year, because with how young the team is right now, you've only got a few years in this window. 5 years from now, we're not going to be saying the same thing about the Cincinnati Reds team. The time for the Reds to make a playoff push and make a World Series run is now. The chance for the Reds to improve has to happen this year. And if it doesn't happen this year, it needs to happen next year, because if not, this Reds team is going to be waiting too long to pull that trigger to try to become a World Series championship caliber team. and all the young players, they're eventually going to be running out of their deals. Some of them, there's a good chance, players such as Ellie De La Cruz, not saying they'd leave Cincinnati, but some teams might offer a little bit more than the Reds do. And in baseball, it's a business. You go where the money is. Not saying Ellie De La Cruz or some of the players for the Reds are going to do it as time goes on, but we've seen it happen with multiple different players on multiple different teams. Money drives players away from the organization they started at. So this Reds team, they need to buy in. They need to buy in the free agency market this offseason to get themselves a chance at a World Series.
With that being said, we'll talk more Cincinnati Reds baseball coming up when we return.
Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee. Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee. Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee.
We welcome you back here to Sports Now. Jackson Lightcap alongside Matthew Pennington. We're talking to Major League Baseball. Although I know that Major League Baseball, they are not particularly in season right now, but there is still a lot going on, especially with free agent looming on the horizon. We've already seen some manager updates. Former Reds manager has now taken over and has become the pitching coach for the San Francisco Giants. So he's back up in the major leagues after a tough stint with the Cincinnati Reds. And Brian Price, unfortunately for him, he was the manager for the Reds during a lot of rebuilding years. So don't necessarily know how great of a chance that he was able to get. But nonetheless, whether he was a great manager or not, he's a great pitching coach, and that is a solid pickup for the San Francisco Giants as well. But Matt, talking about the offseason, there's a lot of rumors going out right now. Obviously, nothing set in stone, but some rumors going out right now. One of the rumors, once again, his name is back in trade talks, just like it was at the trade deadline. Jonathan India, for second baseman from the Cincinnati Reds and reigning NL Rookie of the Year.
Yeah, that's a player that I don't really like seeing being into trade rumors right now, just because we talked about Joey Votto not going to be returning to the Cincinnati Reds. At least that's what that's what the Reds have made it seem like is going to happen. But the reason I don't like, obviously, Jonathan India is a very young player, but having a player like Jonathan India on the team, he's got years of experience under his belt. He's not, if you say that he's a bad player, you just haven't watched him play baseball that much. You've seen a few games where he struggled, and then you framed that as his whole baseball ability for the Cincinnati Reds. But he's the type of player that right now, obviously, like I said, he's a very young player, but he would have that kind of veteran leadership with how young the Cincinnati Reds are as a whole right now. So I personally don't want to see Jonathan India get traded or leave the Cincinnati Reds at all. If he ends up being a utility piece like we were talking about Joey Votto potentially being, if he returned to the Cincinnati Reds, I don't think that's a bad idea. And the other reason I really don't want to see Jonathan India leave Cincinnati is because, say, Elly De La Cruz has played 30 to 40 straight games with no days rest. You could throw a player like Jonathan India in for a day or two, let Elly De La Cruz rest, or really a majority of the interior defense, middle of the field on the defense, shortstop, second base. That's where Jonathan India thrives. If there's a player in either of those two positions that's had a very long stretch of games where they have had no rest, Jonathan India can fill that spot and play great. So I don't really want to see Jonathan India leave Cincinnati, because he's a utility piece that can be used in a lot of different spots in the infield if a player needs a day's rest or if they need another day off to slow down the amount of games and kind of limit the continuous amount of games and tiring themselves out that we saw players such as Elly De La Cruz go through last year. So for the Reds, having Jonathan India, he'll have that, I say leadership, but he's still really young, that leadership mentality for that team. He'd be able to get the team back up in spirits if they ever start getting in a slump or if they ever start feeling down or not so confident in themselves. And then he's also just such a good utility player to have in that lineup for the Cincinnati Reds. He's a utility player that the Reds, obviously, you don't want to see him go, but again, there's so many players in the defense for the Cincinnati Reds in the infield that can have an impact. And this is the only reason I think that right now the Cincinnati Reds are not in talks of trading Jonathan India, but it's in the conversations in people's minds that Jonathan India might not be a Red anymore.
And Matt, one thing I want to talk about with Jonathan India, I personally am against giving him up for some of the reasons that you said, and also the experience that he brings to the table and the leadership that he brings to the table as well. That's a very underrated aspect. You mentioned the days off, and he'll be taking more of a platoon role. I wouldn't expect him to be your everyday second baseman, but with the designated hitter in the National League, I would expect him to still get some good quality playing time. But Matt, it seems as if one thing going back, I'll pause on what my thoughts were there, and I'll bring that up here in just a second. I want to circle back and touch base on this, but the leadership for Jonathan India. Matt, remember, the Reds were playing their best baseball when Jonathan India got hurt in August and missed about a month of the season. The Reds struggled, and they struggled heavily. And I think it was because that they didn't, outside of Joey Votto, they didn't have much veteran leadership on that field as well. We saw India come back. Guess what happened? The Reds started winning. And, maybe the numbers for Jonathan India, they're average. They're not like what he did in his Rookie of the Year season back in 2021. But at the end of the day, he's still been a quality second baseman, and he's still been a quality player for the Cincinnati Reds. Not to mention all the leadership aspect. I personally am against sending out Jonathan India because Jonathan India, that's a guy who will give it your all. Give it his all. That is a guy that who you can count on, and he will take a role of whatever role for that team, and he will make them better. And not to mention, you have him under contract. So if he's a platoon role, then why would you be trying to get rid of that platoon role? Matt, there are maybe some things that aren't being quite as talked about. Maybe Jonathan India isn't okay accepting that platoon role. And I get both sides of the argument. I personally would rather keep Jonathan India, but at the end of the day, if you're being offered a star pitcher for Jonathan India and maybe a prospect or two who can come in and bolster your starting 5 rotation, if the asking price is there, then maybe it is time to part ways. But at the end of the day, we don't know what's going to be offered. I think that the Reds may just be trying to hear offers on Jonathan India. We're waiting to see if anything transpires from it.
And yeah, like you brought up, if it's a worthwhile deal for the Cincinnati Reds, I would hate to see Jonathan India go. But if it's, like you mentioned too, there's also a very good possibility that maybe Jonathan India doesn't want to play that platoon-style role for the Cincinnati Reds, so that can also be a big factor as to why there's talks about him not returning, or it's not that he's not returning. The trade rumors that are going around circling around Jonathan India. But if there's going to be a trade where, obviously, like I said, if it's to send Jonathan India away and it's a lot better value, the players and the prospects that are going to be coming in to the Reds organization, I would hate parting ways with India, but like I said earlier, this is a win-now period for the Cincinnati Reds. So if there's a deal or if there's an offer from another team where, like you mentioned, if there's a star pitcher and maybe a quality prospect to be involved in that trade deal, I would say if it's for the betterment of the team and if it is going to help the Cincinnati Reds win now, like I said, I would hate to see Jonathan India go, but if it's going to help the Cincinnati Reds win now, I would say you'd have to go for it. But that's just because we've seen where Jonathan India has been when it comes to his role in the defense for the Cincinnati Reds. It's a platoon, not a full-on platoon player, but not starting 9 for the Cincinnati Reds, especially with all the prospects the Reds have been bringing up from their minor league teams over this past year. So it seems like as time has gone on, the Reds are slowly starting to force India into that platoon player, into that fit multiple different roles style player. And if it's also not something that Jonathan India wants, I'm not saying it's going to hurt the team keeping him on the roster, but if it's for the betterment of Jonathan India too, with how much I like the guy, I wouldn't be too opposed to sending him somewhere if it's only going to help his career too.
And, not to mention, this may be a factor in these talks that are slid under the rug because, Matt, you and I on this show talk about plenty, time and time again, about how a young team such as the Cincinnati Reds, they need some veteran leadership on that squad. It's a must need. And now with them parting ways with Joey Votto in the offseason, yet there have been yet to maybe be signs that he may be brought back under a cheaper deal. And now the talks of them letting Jonathan India go as well, when you look at just that factor, it may boggle your mind on, the Reds are getting rid of all their veteran leadership. But to me, I think that is foreshadowing that the Reds are going to be active in free agency and bring some other veteran leadership in. Not just veteran leadership, but veteran leadership who has postseason experience as well.
And yeah, that was you were talking about. You just brought up what I was going to say. If the Cincinnati Reds are in talks and if they are going to trade away Jonathan India, then in free agency, they better go out and get a player that is going to be able to lead this team. I'm not saying it has to be Tommy Pham. We've already seen him in Cincinnati. I'm not saying it has to be Tommy Pham exactly, but you take a look at what he was able to do with Arizona. The Reds need to bring in a player like Tommy Pham if they're going to get rid of Jonathan India, because if you don't, like I said, there's a really good chance that if the Reds go on a dry streak at any point during the season, the team's going to get down on themselves, and it's going to be hard to dig themselves out of that hole. If you've got a veteran leader in that lineup, in that roster, and they're able to lift the spirits of the players if they're not confident in themselves, if they're able to get the players to be confident in themselves when they're not, that's only going to help this Reds team. And if you get rid of a player like Jonathan India, there's not really a player on the roster that is going to have that veteran leadership role and that experience to be able to get the team to feel more confident in themselves if they're in a struggle, to get the team rallied if they're starting to go down in the dumps and they're starting to lose a ton of games. If the Reds don't have a player like Jonathan India, or if they decide to trade him away and they don't pick up a player with veteran leadership in free agency, I'm not saying it's guaranteed to be a downward spiral for the Cincinnati Reds, but you're only hurting yourself if you go out and do that. If you get players that are going to be able to, like I said, lift the spirits of the teams if they're feeling down, get the confidence back up in the team. If you go out in free agency and pick up a player that can do that, you're only going to help this Reds team more than you're going to hurt them.
With that being said, it is time for a break. We'll shift our focus from Major League Baseball talk. We'll go in and we'll start talking about college basketball. That's all coming up next on Sports Now.
Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee. Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee. Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee.
We welcome you back here to Sports Now. Jackson Lightcap alongside Matthew Pennington. We are live until 5:30 here on this Tuesday. Tomorrow we'll be back normal. We'll be back live 4 to 6. Once again, big news coming up at the end of our show. But folks, just another reminder, we are live on chat. So make sure to drop any opinions, thoughts, comments, criticism, complaints, and all down below. And if we like it enough, and as long as there's nothing vulgar, we're end up showing it on live air as well. So don't be nervous. Engage.
And if you say that we're terrible, Jackson might not display it as well. So just think about that.
Freedom of speech. I'll still play.
Fair enough.
I'll still throw it up there.
I'd be fine with it.
Freedom of speech.
Criticism is
now, if
good.
I don't see it go up there,
I love how you off camera did not see it.
If I don't see it.
That was funny. That was amazing.
Nonetheless, let's go into some college basketball talk. Last time when we talked college basketball, the UD Flyers were 1-0. Now they dropped to Northwestern on Friday night, 71-66 in a heartbreaking defeat to Northwestern. They now fall to 1-1 so far on the season. They will play LSU this upcoming Thursday night. And Matt, some more news with the UD Flyers. Malachi Smith, it broke last week after their first game of the year. That victory, Malachi Smith is now done for the year. Torn meniscus, had season-ending surgery.
And yeah, we saw when we took a look at and broke down the stats from that first game of the season, we saw that he only played 7 minutes in the game, and I had realized, I think it was around halftime, that he hadn't, because Jackson and I were both at that game, but I think it was around halftime when I noticed, I'm like, I don't think I've seen Smith on the floor in quite some time, but yeah, it's a big loss for this UD Flyers team. It's only going to, obviously, when you have one of your starting five go down for the season, it's only going to hurt your team as a whole, but this this Flyers team, I should say. I would say for the Flyers, we talked about how good their starting five were. They've got a few different players that off the bench have been playing pretty good so far this season. So I wouldn't say that the Flyers are guaranteed to be as good as they would with Malachi Smith out on the floor, but I feel like if the players who weren't in the starting five at the start of the season, if they're going to be able to step up and play big for this Flyers team, I don't think there should be too many worries, especially with how we've seen some of these players for the Flyers come off the bench, such as Bray, such as Bennett. We've seen some pretty nice players come off the bench for the UD Flyers. If they can step up and fill the shoes of Malachi Smith, there's not going to be any worries for this Flyers team. The big question is going to be, how are they going to play against LSU coming up in their next game?
Not to mention, Malachi Smith, the first 10 minutes he was in that game, he already had 4 assists. So that's one of your guards. That's one of your scrappy guards that's going to that's going to cause a lot of turnovers, going to get a lot of steals for your team, and also set your team up for success at the other end of the floor. Now with him out for the rest of the season, just as you mentioned, Matt, the Flyers are going to have to fill that hole. And the biggest question mark for the Flyers heading into the season was their depth. They have a solid starting five. 6-man Kobe Brea has been phenomenal as well during his tenure with the Dayton Flyers as well. But Matt, when you look at that depth overall, that's really been the big question mark for the UD Flyers heading into the season. And now it's going to be questioned even more because guess what? Kobe Brea, he now has to step into that starting rotation with Malachi Smith out for the year.
That's one thing I will say about this Flyers team, too. Without Malachi Smith, they faced off against, at least last year, one of the best teams in the Big Ten in Northwestern. I think Northwestern finished second or third in the Big Ten standings once all was said and done. They only lost that game by 5. So this Flyers team, without Malachi Smith on the floor, without him for the rest of the season, they've already played a pretty tough team, and they've got another tough team coming up. They've still got a few more tough games out of conference as well. They've got SMU on the schedule. They've got UNLV. They've got Cincinnati as some of the teams out of conference that the Flyers have on this season. So you take a look at Northwestern, too. It was a road game, only losing that game by 5, 71-66 the final. Obviously, with how close that game was, the Flyers would have loved to come away with the win. But still, you take a look at the fact that it was a 5-point loss on the road against one of the best teams in the Big Ten from last year. I don't think the Flyers can hang their heads on that loss. But they've got to bounce back, and they've got to get ready for LSU coming up.
And Matt, we talked about last week on our show, which is the most dominant conference in all of college basketball. And Matt, the Big Ten comes to mind. And although we both went with Big 12, Big East as well, but the Big Ten, with how great that they are, especially in the regular season, that is certainly a conference that comes to mind. Obviously, yes, they have not had great postseason success over the last couple of years, but at the end of the day, the Big Ten, no joke, and Northwestern part of the Big Ten, and that's a very tough team for the UD Flyers to face, especially early on. And you get the sense that if it was maybe a little bit later in the season, or if Malachi Smith didn't get hurt in game 1 and was eligible to play last night, you think that maybe the Dayton Flyers would be sitting 2-0 on the season, or if it was a game later in the year, that's a game that they would be able to win as well. But Matt, obviously, things didn't go the Flyers' way. You talk about it. Now they have 6 days to bounce back, get their minds right, and go into their tournament that they have upcoming in Charleston, South Carolina, and take on the LSU Tigers. LSU, we talk about how great the SEC has blown up in basketball as well, especially men's basketball. And LSU, they're part of the SEC. Another tough opponent coming up for the UD Flyers.
And yeah, it would be a pretty big game for the UD Flyers. Both teams, as of right now, are 1-1 on the season. LSU, they're 1-1. They're one of the teams that's further down on the list when it comes to the standings inside of the SEC, but it's because there's only 2 to 3 games played between each team. There's a very good chance this LSU team could fly up the rankings, but they've got some pretty tough teams inside of the SEC. You mentioned, I mean, you take a look at the SEC. They've got 5 teams inside of the top 25 right now. 3 teams inside of the top 15, Tennessee being the highest ranked team at 7. A&M, they sit at 13. Arkansas, they sit at 14. You've got a ton of good teams inside of the SEC. Kentucky's another team. They're not even inside the top 15, but they're 17, and you know how good Kentucky has been in basketball in years past. So you talk about how good the SEC is. This is going to be a big test and a big game for this UD Flyers team. Obviously, with how close you played against Northwestern, you'd love to be able to get a win against the LSU Tigers. It's not going to be a guaranteed win for the Flyers, but you want to talk about a confidence booster, and one other thing you brought up when they came to the Northwestern game, I fully think if that game against Northwestern was played, I would say a week or 2 from now, not the first game off of Malachi Smith being out for the season and the Flyers players hearing that and knowing about that, I would say the Flyers could have won that game, but that's not how the schedule was set up. That's not how the cookie crumbles. The Flyers had to face off against Northwestern in Game 2 of the season. They lost it by 5. Best way you can get back from that, bounce back against this LSU Tigers team.
And Matt, not to mention, this is also an LSU Tigers team that came down, that lost by 2 points. They lost 68-66 last Friday as well to Nichols as well, a game that they ultimately should have won, a game that they were favored to win. Nichols came into Baton Rouge and was able to take down the Tigers 68-66 in a game that the Tigers just ultimately had nothing going. So now we've seen the Tigers, I don't want to say necessarily at their worst, but a game that they did not play real well in. But they also, to open up the season, put up 106 on Mississippi Valley State as well, a team that they should have crushed at home. Exactly what they did, 106-60, where everything was going in the LSU Tigers' favor as well. So we've seen the Tigers at their best. We've seen them at their worst this season. And Matt, I don't think that we've seen the University of Dayton. I don't think we've seen the Flyers so far at their best this season as well. So it should be a tremendous game. And I know that it's the A-10 going up against the SEC. The SEC, they can claim that they're a top 5 powerhouse conference in all of NCAA. But at the end of the day, this is a Dayton team that can very, very well compete and take down LSU on Thursday night at the Charleston Classic.
Yeah, it's definitely a game that this Flyers team could come out if they fire on all cylinders at the start. And the one thing I will say for this Flyers team, if they don't have segments during the game where the offense isn't scoring at all, this University of Dayton team can easily take down LSU. But it's the question of, like I said, are there going to be those dry spells? Is there going to be those moments during the game where the Flyers, no matter what they try to do on the offensive side, they can't score at all? If that ends up happening, if that ends up showing itself a few different times during the game, I don't think the Flyers take this one against LSU. But even in moments where the offense is dried up, there's not anything landing, if they can get a few baskets here or there and stop LSU from going on, say, an 11-0 run, they make it, say, 11-4 the score margin during that run, I would say it's very likely that this Flyers team can come away with the win, because we talk about that dry spell that the Flyers go on. We've also seen quite a few times this season moments where in 2 minutes the Flyers put up a double-digit amount of points, and they're continuing that momentum throughout the entirety of that the entirety of that run that they've gone on. So this Flyers team so far this season, It's a story of hot and cold basketball. There's moments where they're not scoring at all, and there's also moments where, like I said, they're putting up 10 points in 2 minutes or something along those lines. So if we see more consistently towards that Flyers team putting up a ton of points in a short period of time, and then in the moments where they're not scoring, they're able to put up a basket here or there, kind of mitigate the damage and not allow a team such as LSU to just absolutely pull a massive lead against them, this Flyers team can easily take down the Tigers. It's a question of what type of Flyers team we're going to see in that game, though.
And with that being said, it is time for a break. When we return, we will talk about the other Dayton team as well, the Wright State Raiders. They are looking to avoid a 0-2 start to start their season tonight. So we'll talk about that coming up next on Sports Now.
Come on, guys, let's call Daddy. Hi, Daddy.
Hi! How you doing?
So the furnace is on its last leg, babe. And I just don't know what to do.
I wish I could be there to help.
Being away is always difficult, but it doesn't mean you can't make decisions together. You can count on us to keep your family comfortable.
Hey, buddy, how's it going?
When are you coming home?
It's gonna be soon. Faster than you know it, I'll be home.
Breathe easy. Choose McAfee.
Come on, guys, let's call Daddy. Hi, Daddy.
Hi!
How you doing?
So the furnace is on its last leg, babe. And I just don't know what to do.
I wish I could be there to help.
Being away is always difficult, but it doesn't mean you can't make decisions together. You can count on us to keep your family comfortable.
Hey, buddy, how's it going?
When are you coming home?
It's gonna be soon. Faster than you know it, I'll be home.
Breathe easy. Choose McAfee.
The Wright State Raiders are back at home at the Nutter Center for the first time of the 2023-24 season. They will look to avoid going 0-2 to start the year. They tipped off their season last Friday, where they ended up losing on the road to Colorado State. Colorado State, a much bigger school than Wright State is, but they lost that one pretty big, 101-77. And Matt, when you talk about Colorado State and Wright State, obviously Wright State, a lot of high expectations this season in the Horizon League. They were picked 4th in the preseason poll to win the Horizon League. Obviously, things can happen. They returned Trey Calvin. They have a very, very good upperclassman heavy team. The Wright State Raiders do. But Matt, Colorado State, they're no joke this season in the Mountain West Conference, the Mountain West League. They play in a very tough Mountain West Conference that includes teams such as San Diego State and San Diego State, Boise State, Utah State, so much more as well. Last season, they finished towards the bottom of the Mountain West Conference, but a chance this season that they returned a lot of players. Colorado State, they're expecting a big year, just as Wright State did. And ultimately, it wasn't the Wright State offense that lost them that game, putting up 77 points. It was the defense, and Colorado State just shot lights out.
And yeah, that's one thing that you take a look at the scoring for both of these teams. 28-point loss for the Raiders of Wright State. And you put up 77 points in that game. Really, in a majority of college basketball games, if you put up 77 points, your team should be in the conversation of either a close loss or a win. And they lost by 28 points. So that defense is definitely what ended up costing the Raiders in their first game of the season. They've got a tough test against Toledo tonight, and then in 2 days, they're at Indiana. So this Wright State team, that's one thing that's also going to help them when it comes down to them starting off their in-conference play, in Horizon League play. You take a look at their out-of-conference schedule that they've got on this season. You've also got Davidson. You've got Western Kentucky. You've got Louisiana. You've got a ton of tough teams out of conference for this Wright State squad that they're playing against in their out-of-conference games. Colorado State as well. It's only going to help this Raiders team once they start getting into conference play, because especially you take a look at teams like Toledo, teams such as Indiana, Davidson. In the Horizon League, you're not going to face off against a team like Indiana. You're not going to face off against a team like Colorado State, like Toledo. You're going to have those good teams inside of the Horizon League, but they're not going to be to the lengths of teams like Indiana or teams like Davidson, teams like Western Kentucky and Toledo. So these out-of-conference games for the Raiders, it's definitely going to help them more than hurt them when it comes to them starting to get into conference play, which the very first game they have in conference is the 29th of this month against IUPUI. So it's an earlier start of in-conference games for this Raiders team. They've obviously only have that game until they face off against Green Bay a month after the game against IUPUI. They play Green Bay on December 29th. They play IUPUI this upcoming 29th. So they've got a little bit of time between that IUPUI game and their full slate of conference games. So there's a good chance that this tough schedule for this Raiders team is going to help them when it comes down to getting into that big bulk of conference play that they've got starting around the later stages of December.
Not to mention they played Toledo tonight at home, and Toledo coming out of the MAC conference. That's going to be a tough matchup for Wright State as well. But Matt, going back into that loss against Colorado State on Friday night, this is a Colorado State team that shot 41% from beyond the arc against Wright State. This is a team that shot 64% from the field against Wright State, and they also nailed 82% of their free throws as well. Colorado State, they shot the ball lights out. Matt, I will also say this, though. You look at Wright State, they turned over the ball quite a bit, but at the end of the day, here's the discrepancy of points right here. 28 points off turnovers for Colorado State in that game. Wright State, when they turned over the basketball, Colorado State was making them pay. And that's ultimately why we saw the big win for Colorado State. Wright State, they have got to limit the turnovers, and obviously it's basketball. Turnovers are going to happen a little bit more than what we see in football games. The turnover differential could play a factor in it, but it's not as big as a factor than what we see in football games. But Matt, Wright State, when they turn over the basketball, that's basketball. It's going to happen. But when you turn over the basketball, you have got to get back on defense and you have got to guard, because 28 points off of those turnovers are going to that ultimately is going to catch up to you. That's exactly what happened to Wright State the other night.
So you've got the stat for the amount of points that Colorado State got off of turnovers. How many did Wright State get?
7.
Yeah, that is obviously 21 points wouldn't have gotten Wright State the win in this game.
They're right back in that
but
game.
Yeah, 21 points puts it down to 84-77. That's the score. The 21-point difference in points off of turnovers.
And not to mention that completely changes the game plan later in the game, because when you're down that much inside 5 minutes, what are you trying to do? You have to go on a long run. And what sparks your runs? You're maybe taking a little bit more shots from beyond the arc than what you usually would and now you don't even have time to run your fluent offense as well. If you take away those points off turnovers and make it even, and they're only down by 7 in the later stages of the fourth, Wright State, they still will have time to run their offense. They'll still have time to get open looks instead of having to force shots like they had to do later in the game.
And yeah, you talk about those points off of turnovers. I mean, with it being a 21-point margin in points off of turnovers, obviously, like you brought up too, turnovers are going to happen in basketball. That's just the way the sport's played. Sometimes you've got aggressive defenses that are trying to force the ball out of your hands, and they're trying to get the ball back into the hands of their offense. So it's going to happen. You're going to see turnovers. It's tough to say that a team is going to be able to turn the ball over, I'd say, under 5 times in a game. I'd say 5 times is right around that low limit that we're going to see some of the better ball security teams have, would be right around 5 turnovers a game, because sometimes you get a bad pass that goes out of bounds. That's a turnover. So you give the ball back into the hands of the other team. That counts as a turnover against your team. It's tough to pass perfect the entire game as well. So
offensive fouls come into play as well when it comes into turnovers. And, you know, Matt, one thing I want to mention before I actually have the numbers, Wright State, they turn over the basketball 15 times. 15 times. So that's obviously the higher end. You don't want to turn over the basketball 15 times. That's over the average, what we've been talking about. But at the end of the day, 28 points off of 15 turnovers. That is way too many to allow from the Wright State Raiders. Colorado State, they turned over the ball 9 times. And Wright State only had 7 points off those turnovers. Turnovers and the points off turnovers is what hurt the Wright State Raiders the other night on Friday night. They have to clean up the offense. They can't be turning over the ball that much. And again, obviously, we're not saying that you're not going to be able to turn the basketball over at all tonight against Toledo. But if you can limit the turnovers and keep it, I'd say between 7 to 12 turnovers. But if you can get back on defense and stomp the points off of turnovers, that's really and just going to increase and boost your team and help you give you a chance to win later down in the stretch in the second half.
And yeah, that's one thing that I would say Wright State would have to work on. You talk about 15 turnovers in game number 1 of the season. Obviously, we've just went into a whole spiel as to why it's almost impossible to get it down to 0, but I would say if you limit it to maybe 7 to 10 turnovers in the game, I think that, I mean, obviously with the fact that you already had 15, it's going to be tough to get that average down to around 7 to 10 turnovers unless you only turn the ball over 7 times every single game for the rest of the season. So I would say if you're this Wright State team, slowly limit the turnovers. You don't have to try to play the best ball security game you can have in college basketball because, like you said, offensive fouls, those count as turnovers. An errant pass that might just barely, say, slip out of the player who's passing its hands, or it might just barely sail out of bounds. That counts as a turnover too. It's tough to limit those kinds of plays, especially sometimes the communication might be swinging around the perimeter. One player decides, oh, there's an open lane to the basket. Let me cut inside. Pass goes to where the player was because the player passing the ball anticipated him to still be at the perimeter, but he saw an open lane to cut towards the basket. You're going to have some types of turnovers like that. It's tough to play a perfect, full game of basketball in college basketball and in college hoops. So if you're this Raiders team, like I said, it's going to be tough to drop it all the way down to 7 tonight against Toledo, but you've got to limit the amount of turnovers, especially, well, I say limit the amount of turnovers. Like you mentioned, Jackson, you have to limit the amount of points off of turnovers. If the Raiders can figure out how to stop that, if they can get back on defense and not allow their opponent, if they turn the ball over, to score almost every single time, this Raiders team is only going to get better and better as the season goes on.
Time for a break. We will I want to say move into hour number 2 of this 2-hour show, but that's just a force of habit. Remember, this show is done at 5:30. Big news coming at the end. So let's move into the final third.
Final third. There you
Let's
go.
move into the final third of this hour and a half show coming up next on Sports Now.
Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee. Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee. Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee.
Well, the NBA has implemented an in-season tournament for the first time in the National Basketball Association's history. So, and not only that, but the in-season tournament will tip off tonight. So tonight we will see the first ever NBA in-season tournament. Matt, your thoughts?
I'm just excited to see how it plays out this first year, to see if it's worth all of the hype that was sent towards it with all the commercials you were seeing on multiple different networks about this in-season tournament. It's going to be interesting to see if it lives up to the hype, because if it does, I don't think it's something the NBA should get rid of. If it doesn't live up to the hype, then maybe I wouldn't say get rid of it right away, because some things take time to show growth and show development and show that it's actually something that's really good, especially for the NBA. But like I said, I'm just excited to see what it is going to bring to the table, what it's going to end up bringing out with all these teams that are playing tonight. I know my Bulls don't play tonight, so I think that would mean that they have a first-round bye, I would guess, when it comes to the in-season tournament. I haven't kept too much focus on it. I'm just excited to see how it plays out for all the teams. But yeah, to me, it's a learning experience. Let's see what it's going to be like. Let's see if it's worth keeping and worth sticking with for years to come. And if it's something that's entertaining, if it's something that the NBA feels like they need to keep bringing back, by all means, keep bringing it back. It's only going to drive viewership. It's only going to increase the attention rate for NBA games, and increase market sales and whatnot for the NBA. So if it's something that all the teams are going to be fighting to try to win that trophy, and all the teams are going to be trying to fight to win this in-season tournament, keep it around. That's the one thing that I want to see from it. I want to see competitiveness from every single team. I don't want to see teams that are like, we don't care about this tournament. We're not going to try. We're just going to get first round out and we're going to be done with it. We don't want to play in this tournament. If it's stuff like that, then it's, to me, going to be a little bit of a flop. But if you've got almost, I wouldn't say it has to be every single team, but if you have a vast majority of teams playing their hearts out, fighting to try to be the team that's going to be hoisting that trophy once this tournament comes to a close, then I think there needs to be, and there's going to be reasons to keep it around. But like I said, if you see a majority of teams kind of have the mindset of, this tournament doesn't mean much, we're not gonna risk hurting our players, we're not gonna risk, trying too hard during this in-season tournament. If it's just a few games and there's no real incentive to really try during it, then there's a chance I could see it flopping. But if it's the latter, if it's, hey, we want this trophy, it's going into the trophy room, we're getting this trophy this year, and you see a majority of teams doing that with that mindset, I think this tournament should stay around for years to come.
I completely agree with that. And I think that this is going to be a great test for the NBA to see how it goes out. Again, it doesn't hurt to try new things. It does not hurt to try new things, and that's exactly what we're seeing the NBA do right now. Matt, I will say this. I'm a little confused on why we're going with an in-season tournament to begin with. And the reason why I say that is because you have the entire playoffs, the postseason tournament at the end, and now you're going to have 2 trophies given out, one during the regular season for the in-season tournament, and now one for the NBA Finals. So how is that ultimately going to mix well together? To be, in my opinion, call me a traditionalist, call me old-fashioned, but I think that there should just be one big tournament at the end of the season called the playoffs, and the winner of that wins the entire league. I think that with an in-season tournament, it's just going to make it confusing and miscue a lot of, they were your in-season tournament champions, they were your NBA Finals champions. So now, over time, how is that going to mix together? I guess is that my question. And I guess I have a lot of questions right now because it's the first year, and as do a lot of people have great questions for it being the first year. And again, it doesn't hurt to try new things. And I think that's what the NBA is going to. The reason why I think they're going to this NBA in-season tournament is to bring in more viewership for the regular season. Not to mention, Matt, this is going to bring in, because what has been the NBA's problem early on in the season for so long? They're competing with college basketball. They're competing with college football. They're competing with NFL football as well. And when they start the year, they're also competing with the World Series and Major League Baseball as well. So it seems like NBA, they've always had to compete. They've never had the viewership such as Major League Baseball, NFL, college basketball, college football, yada, 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 yada. So these sports that they're competing with, so the NBA, in my opinion, I think this is why they're implementing this. I think they're implementing this in-season tournament to get more viewership as well, to get more viewership, to take it away from college, not take it away from college basketball or NFL football or anything along those lines, but to make the beginning of the NBA season a little bit more interesting. And Matt, not to mention this in-season tournament, we are going to be able to see some of the teams at their true potential. They are winning to play something, so now we're going to be able to see what maybe the Indiana Pacers, the Cleveland Cavaliers, the Milwaukee Bucks can all bring to the table, whereas in years past, it's you go through the regular season and kind of figure it out. I have very mixed emotions on this in-season tournament. I'm excited to see how it's going to play out. But again, I'm a traditionalist. It's going to be hard to convince me that the in-season tournament for the NBA is going to be a good idea. But again, I'm excited to try new things. I'm excited to see how it goes. I think we all owe it to see how it plays out. And I'm excited to see how it plays out. And I'm excited to see how it's going to play out for years to come, or if it will be obsolete here in just 5 to 10 years.
And yeah, that's going to be one thing too when it comes down to this in-season tournament that you talk about. Why would you have a in-season tournament and then the postseason for the NBA? I would say the one way to make that less confusing, and it would be weird to do this, but we see it in college basketball, all the different tournaments that we're seeing that are starting up, I believe, for men's. It's this weekend or something. It's starting soon for a lot of, you've got the Maui Invitational. You got a ton of different tournaments in college basketball that you're seeing around this time of the year. So I would say maybe call it for the NBA, since all of the commercials, and I'm pretty sure it's being held around Vegas, maybe call it like the Vegas Cup or something like that. So it's not in-season tournament, because if you name it in-season tournament,
then it's
that
like
kind
you're
of
crowning regular season champions.
That's what I'm saying. And if it's like the Vegas Cup, that doesn't make it seem like, oh, this is for the regular season
smart
championship
idea.
or something along those
college
lines.
basketball, they do that quite a bit. You have the Maui Invitational, just as you mentioned. UD this weekend is going to Charleston, South Carolina to play in a tournament as well. But you can win that tournament. It brings recognition to your program, which is exactly what the NBA is going to do. But they call it the Maui Invitational. They call it different names, and they give out different trophies, where the NBA, they're just calling it in-season tournament. I like that idea. They should be calling it something else on the separate location. And maybe instead of having one big combined tournament, maybe there's 32 teams in the NBA. Maybe you break it up. Maybe you have 4 different little tournaments with 8 different teams in that tournament. Maybe you divide it up a little bit, kind of like what college basketball does, so that you're not seeing a full-on NBA tournament in the regular season. Again, I think that this, because it's the first year in any major sport, this is the first year that we've seen it outside of soccer. We've seen it occur in soccer many times before, but outside of soccer in any major sport, this is really the first time we've seen this happen. And so obviously it's going to be a lot of trial by error. I'm not expecting it to go off 100% in the NBA's favor in year number 1. But the question is, in year number 1, is this something that they can build on? And what can they adjust? What can they fix to make it something that they can build on in upcoming years? Tonight's the first night of the in-season tournament. Like I said, I'm excited to see how it plays out, but I do think it is going to be trial by error within the first year. And I think this is something that the NBA can make very effective long-term, although it might be a struggle starting off.
And yeah, like that's one thing for this tournament that I was talking about. We need to see what it does this first year, see how well it does overall, see if there's teams competing. And the reason I would say that there's a good chance that not every single team is going to be fully focused on this in-season tournament, and they're going to be fully focused on trying to win the trophy at the end of it, is because you've got teams that at this point of the season right now, with how good they've started off, the 76ers come to mind. They're a one-loss team right now. I wouldn't say that the 76ers are fully looking at this in-season tournament right now. I would say they're probably looking towards the NBA postseason right now with how good of a season they've started off with. So I'm not saying that it's guaranteed that these teams aren't going to be trying their best. These teams aren't going to be playing their hearts out and aren't going to be playing their best basketball, but you just get the feeling that it's not guaranteed that we're going to see these teams putting 100% on the floor every single game. I'm not saying that it's guaranteed we're not going to be seeing that, but like I said, you've got teams that, as of right now, they're already looking like playoff caliber teams inside of the NBA, and those teams, I'm not saying that they're not going to be looking at this tournament like, oh, let's win this in-season tournament. They're focused on making it to the postseason right now. So I would say the mindset of teams that are currently looking towards the postseason, and then you've got teams that right now, obviously it's very early in the year, and this might be how this ends up working out for the NBAs because it's so early in the year, but if this were to happen midway through the season, I don't think this would work at all because it would only amplify the idea that I talked about. You've got those teams that are poised to make a postseason run, and you've got those teams that midway point of the season, they're like, okay, we probably aren't going to make it into the postseason this year, so we're not really going to be focused on making it to the postseason. You're going to have those teams that aren't really focused on making it into the postseason trying a lot more to win the in-season tournament than a team like, say, the 76ers halfway through the season or, say, a 9-loss team. The 76ers, as a 9-loss team halfway through the season, that's 32-9. They are looking for the playoffs. They're not looking for an in-season tournament. They're looking for the playoffs. So when it comes down to the timing of it, I think this is really the only time that it works for the NBA is doing it this early in the season. Because it's tough to say that the 76ers right now at 8-1 are going to stay at the pace of being around winning 8 of 9 games every single 9 games they play because the season's so early and the season's so fresh and the season's so young. So I don't think that there's going to be those teams that aren't trying and those teams that are trying. I don't see that being too big of an issue right now when it comes to this in-season tournament, but it's also something that if it does end up being an issue and it does end up being a factor, I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years this tournament is done away with.
With that being said, it is time for break. When we return, we will also close out our show. We'll announce our big news, but first, we'll make our college football playoff rankings prediction. The new college football playoff ranking will come out tonight, so we'll make our predictions ahead of that 7 o'clock showtime. We'll make our big announcement. We'll close out this hour-and-a-half show on Sports Now.
Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee. Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee. Every day, we find ourselves on a path full of decisions.
It's me.
Sometimes small and sometimes big. Sometimes alone and sometimes together. At McAfee, everything we do is done with your comfort, health, and convenience in mind. She always wanted the best for you, and now you can rest knowing you've provided the best for her. Breathe easy. Choose McAfee.
College football playoff, the playoff rankings, the new updated playoff rankings will be released tonight. I believe it'll be released right around 7 p.m. as well. But Matt, we talk about the top 8 teams in college football the college football playoff rankings right now. Ohio State, Georgia, Michigan, Florida State, they're your top 4. Washington in 5, Oregon 6, Texas in 7, Alabama in 8. And those are really the only 8 teams that have a legitimate shot at making the playoffs still. Obviously, some teams may need a lot more help than others, But Matt, any movement we could see before the third edition of the college football playoff rankings are released? If you want me to start, I said this last week, and after their big win against Utah, I think Washington, once again, should be jumping Florida State.
Yeah, I think the Huskies, especially when you take a look at, obviously Miami wasn't an easy opponent for Florida State, but it was another game that they played close. And then you've got, obviously, Washington facing off against Utah, who was a top 25 team. Obviously, Utah kept it close as well, but Miami wasn't inside of the top 25. Utah was. Both teams winning close games, but I just think right now Washington should be ahead of Florida State. I think it should be close between the two. Like, it could flip back and forth any given week, but I think right now, I think the way it should be after this past week, if the committee looks at Ohio State and the score of that game, if they just look at the score, I would say Georgia 1, Ohio State 2, Michigan 3, Washington 4, Florida State 5, Oregon, Texas, Alabama probably staying the same, 6 through 8. But if the committee takes into account that Ohio State pretty much pulled all of their starters and all their playmakers early in the third quarter, and that's why the Buckeyes weren't able to do anything in that second half when it comes to scoring, if we see the committee take that into account, then I think Ohio State can stay at 1, but it's only if they look at it that way. Just because you take a look at who Georgia just took down. They just took down Ole Miss, they just took down, it was Ole Miss. They destroyed Ole Miss. Michigan just took down Penn State. So those are two pretty big quality wins for both Georgia and Michigan. So you talk about, should a team move up? Should a team stay where they're at? I think Georgia, with how big of a win and how dominant of a win they had against Ole Miss, I think that should put them up over Ohio State. Michigan, not as dominant of a win against Penn State, but it was still a win against a pretty good, pretty high-quality team. So I would say it should be Georgia, close between Ohio State and Michigan, but Ohio State staying at 2, Michigan staying at 3. But like I said, it being very close between the two of those teams. Washington at 4, Florida State 5, Oregon, Texas, Alabama. And then one team that you didn't talk about could still potentially be in the playoff hunt. I say this, but I said it about UNC the last time I talked about an ACC team sneaking their way in and potentially being a sneaky team. Louisville at 9. They're a one-loss team. I know that they have Kentucky as their last game of the season. If the internet lets me look up their second-to-last game of the year. I know it's not an easy opponent for their second-to-last game. It might be Miami, but I might be wrong on that. But the Louisville Cardinals, they've got a...
Yes, it is Miami. You are correct.
Okay, so I was right on that. But Louisville, they've got a pretty tough schedule for their last 2 games of the season. They've got Miami, a pretty decent team. They've got Kentucky, an SEC team who's looked pretty good so far this season at times. They've also had times where they didn't look that good. But if Louisville stays undefeated throughout the remainder of this season and destroys Florida State in the ACC championship game, because that's the 2 teams that it looks like are going to be inside of the ACC championship game, I don't see why you should be looking past Louisville potentially being a team making it into the college football playoff, because they're definitely a team, at least as of right now, everybody has looked past Louisville just because they weren't really ranked high to begin with at the start of the season, but they've clawed their way up the rankings. They've continued to move their way up the rankings and move their way up that totem pole. And if they end up winning the ACC championship game, I think they would need some help around them. But you can't take this Louisville Cardinals team out of the conversation either.
No, you cannot take out Louisville out of the picture. And, Matt, I like how you brought them up. But, Matt, Louisville, they need a lot of help no matter what. First of all, they're going to have to win out. They're going to have to win out convincingly because you take a look at the teams in front of them. You talk about Alabama. They still have to play Georgia in the SEC championship. If they are able to win out, they make a case of being in the college football playoff. And then you have, if Alabama beats Georgia in the SEC championship, is Georgia still going to make it as a one-loss team? You could say the same thing about Ohio State, Michigan. Whoever loses the game in Ann Arbor, are they still going to make it as a one-loss team? You can talk about, obviously, Washington and Oregon still could very well meet in the Pac-12 championship. You still have Texas to play in the Big 12 championship. Louisville and Florida State, it's looking like they're playing the ACC championship. But, Matt, I will say this. This is the last season that college football is going with a 4-team playoff. Next year, they switch to a 12-team playoff, and they truly are saving the best playoff for last because this season there's been so much movement. There's so many quality teams that deserve to be in the college football playoff that unfortunately will not be able to. And Matt, I will say this, I expect Ohio State to stay in that one spot just mainly because they have pulled their starters out. And even with them pulling their starters out, they still won 35-3. I expect Georgia to stay in 2. I expect Michigan to stay in 3. I do expect, and I said this last week, so don't quote me on this, I do expect Washington to jump Florida State, especially Washington coming off a big win against Utah. Utah, usually a very good defensive team, one of the few great defensive teams in the Pac-12. They put up 35. Washington, they're legit. I've said this all along. They deserve to be in that 4 spot.
And there's another prediction I'm going to have right now when it comes down to Ohio State, Michigan. As long as, I would say, as long as both of those teams don't make it, or, well, one of the teams, whoever wins, is more than likely locking themselves into the college football playoff. But Ohio State, Michigan, if the team that loses the game doesn't make it into the college football playoff, I wouldn't be surprised if the first team to not make it in is going to be Ohio State or Michigan. Going to be that 5 seed for the final playoff rankings.
With that being said, the TKDS Sports Network is super excited. Here's your big news. The TKDS Sports Network is super excited to partner with Wittenberg University, NCAA Division III athletics. All Wittenberg games will be broadcasted on the TKDS Sports Network. They will also be sending, the TKDS Sports Network will also be played on the Tiger Sports Network on YouTube, and it is also going to be available on the TKDS Sports Network radio network on the Google Play Store. So that's one of the reasons why we have to end our show early, because Matt, you and I, we have a college basketball game to call tonight at 7 o'clock. That's why we're a little bit fancier than what you usually would see us wear on this show. Matt's looking mighty fresh over there. So yes, college basketball. So Wittenberg, they will be playing Wilmington, the Quakers. It is a backyard showdown. Wilmington, not too far from the Dayton area. Wittenberg and Springfield, not too far from the Dayton area. But once again, all Wittenberg basketball games, men's and women's, can be viewed on the TKDS Sports Network, any of their social media pages, on the TKDS Sports Network radio, which can be downloaded by app on the Google Play. You can watch them all. You can upgrade to a package to watch all those games on Roku as well, Roku Fire Stick TV, and it'll also be on Wittenberg's Athletics, the Wittenberg Tiger Sports Network's YouTube page as well. So, Matt, you and I were filling in for some wonderful announcers. One of the announcers actually taught us in high school, Scott Leo. He is the play-by-play voice for the men's. He could not make it tonight, so I'll be filling in the play-by-play, and Matt, you're coming along with me as well.
Like I said, I'm excited for it. It's my first NCAA college basketball announcing gig that I've got, so I'm pumped for it.
Tip off at 7 o'clock. Make sure to tune in on any of those other sites that I just said. If you need a link, go to TKDS Sports, any of our social media pages, right up there in the corner. TKDS Sports. Alongside Matthew Pennington, I'm Jackson Lightcap. We're taking the trip to Wittenberg. We'll talk to you then. But until then, if you're not going to listen to or watch the game tonight, tune in tomorrow. We're live 4 to 6 tomorrow. But until then, thanks for dealing with us. We'll talk to you later.